Yeah, I mean, I could see why bands ran away from it. Like, are you familiar with Pantera's glam past? Do they call it
Oh,
Glamtera?
oh, absolutely.
So I love a lot of that music, a lot of their older albums, but
Right.
they knew that if they spoke about that as they were number one on Billboard charts, they would be dead. Like it was embarrassing to have those photos out
Oh,
there.
totally.
And I've even read interviews where they talk where at the time they were asking Dimebag Darrell about he went from Diamond Darrell to Dimebag Darrell, and the band was pissed. He was always Dimebag. It
Right.
was a misprint, and we all know that that's bullshit. But at the same time, I understand that bands like that, in order to keep their credibility, they kind of had to hide. And a lot of those '90s bands lit Alice in Chains. A lot of these bands started on the glam scene,
Oh,
and they
right.
just knew that when they blew up, it was uncool, and they covered it up like it was a scandal.
But very few of those bands didn't have some kind of hair metal past. I mean, Lane Staley, there's stuff on YouTube where he's glammed up to the nines. And, when you mentioned Pantera, I do think that Daryl always was pretty open about his love of bands like Van Halen and things like that. There's actually a really cool concert. It's at some festival. I think it's in Italy, and Warrant's playing there, and they're on a bill with Pantera. And that is a really awkward pairing. But here comes Dimebag Daryl out in the middle of Warrant's set with a bottle of Jägermeister. And
That
I'm
is cool.
that guy seemed like just such a big fan of music that he was going to be like, screw it. I'm going to go on stage with Warrant, where a lot of people, even if they liked Warrant, would have said, like, stay away, don't acknowledge it, pretend that we have nothing to do with that. And, so that bothers me. But there are guys, like Daryl, that were pretty open about their love of that kind of music. And I always respected that.
Yeah, and things do come around with that too. In that I think a lot of those bands, when Pantera blew up, were trying to be Pantera. Because you listen to
Oh,
Motley Crue 1994, I feel like if you listen to a song like "Smoke the Sky," Tommy Lee is doing his best. Vinnie Paul on the drums, I definitely feel like, and
totally.
we've even talked about some of the more obscure bands. Wow, who am I thinking of now? Their name is Shotgun Messiah.
Not gonna
I've
say.
seen interviews with them where at the very time that Second Coming album came out was the time where Pantera were blowing up the charts, and they were trying to stray from their hair metal image a little bit.
Yep.
And I see you find it on YouTube somewhere. They were asked about one of their ballads, and they were like, "Yeah, but it's not like one of these glam ballads. This is kind of like a Pantera ballad, like
Right.
Cemetery Gates," because I think they saw what was happening, and
Sure.
they knew that there was just a new era coming in. And yeah, I think a lot of those bands wanted to be Pantera, changed the image completely. At the time, the Pantera was cool, and they just went on stage with a snapback hat and basketball shorts, and it was no longer cool to wear makeup or anything, hot pink or anything like that.
Yeah. And if there was a band that I thought was gonna survive, I thought it was gonna be Skid Row. Um, their debut, sells 5 million copies, and then I thought they struck the perfect balance of
Yes.
heaviness, but still, maintaining. They had ballads, they had straight ahead rock on their follow up, Slave to the Grind. It debuted at number one on Billboard, and I love that album. Um, so I thought, you know what, this is a band that's gonna be able to survive. But then in '95, they come out with Subhuman Race, and a lot of people forget they toured with Pantera, and I saw that show in Fargo, and I had no clue who Pantera was. This is 1992. I'm like, fucking Pantera, what? Why don't you have like Stage Dolls or something, opening? Well, anyway, obviously Pantera leapfrogs them, but then Subhuman Race to me is them trying to be Pantera. It failed miserably. And like I said, I mean, I get people saying, I want to stay relevant. I have to change with the times. Nobody knew back then what was going to happen. You just knew that the bands, all the bands, all your compadres that you came up with were dying, and you're like, okay, well, hey, maybe if we do a Pantera album, it'll work for us, and it didn't. But Yeah, so many of those. I think Shotgun Messiah, the album after Second Coming, Violent New Breed
They were
was
doing like an industrial type thing, right? And that's
totally.
the same thing as Faster Pussycat kind of did.
Faster Pussycat did the same thing.
Yeah.
And you know, and I loved the early Shotgun Messiah and Second Coming. I think you mentioned that the other day. It did get heavier, but it struck the right balance. But then they abandoned any semblance of their old sound, and you know, how did that work out? Not very well.
Yeah, because people still know it's the same name. You know, you put out albums under that name. Pantera weren't a signed band, so they were they were able to get away with it because before Cowboys from Hell, they were a local band.
Yep.
You were talking about Subhuman Race. By any chance, did you hear when it was pretty recent? Sebastian Bach was on Eddie Trunk and he talked about the production of that album.
I don't know if I heard that, but I've listened to so many interviews about that. So go ahead. Or
Yeah, what he said was kind of interesting because this is at least how he explained it. Because Eddie Trunk loves Subhuman Race, he
yeah,
said. And I don't think Sebastian Bach is the biggest fan of it the way that he was speaking about it. And he said at the time we got Bob Rock on as the producer because he was like, you know, I can't do a Sebastian Bach. We fucking love Dr. Feelgood, man. So that's why he said they brought on Bob Rock. And he said at the time,
and
Bob
Bob
Rock
Rock had
kept.
also done Metallica's Black Album. You
Yes,
know,
but he
so
says
two of
that
the
at the time, Bob Rock, and I do have Metallica there, but he said that Bob Rock kept talking about the stuff he was doing with Veruca Salt, and it was something that he kept focusing on. And this band Veruca Salt's going to be huge. And Sebastian Bach was saying, "But what about Dr. Feelgood, bro? That's what we're trying to sound like." So he made it sound like Bob Rock pushed them in a direction that they really didn't want to go.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I believe that. Like I said, I mean, they went out with Pantera, and so I felt like, and obviously Slave to the Grind was so much harder than the debut. So, you know, production might have had something to do with that, but all of those riffs um were screaming we are going to be the heavy, you know, the heaviest. I reviewed that album in one of my videos. I reviewed all the Skid Row
I
albums.
saw it. I'm a Hair Metal Haven super
I just
fan.
kept saying it is so fucking heavy, but not in a good way. I mean, just brutally heavy. I don't get into, you know, I like heavy metal. I like old school Metallica, but that Subhuman Race album was, the songs just, the melody wasn't there. It was heavy for the sake of heavy. So who's to blame? I mean, nobody wants to take responsibility for that, because that album, you know, was, when it came out, a lot of people were still like, hey, Skid Row still, you know, is going to be one of those bands that climbs the mountain. But once that album died, then it became pretty obvious that they were falling, you know, by the wayside along with everybody else. And Sebastian ended up getting fired about a year later.